Have you ever wondered what purity culture and the purity movement is, or what the effects of growing up in that system are? Well, look no further as I interview Allison Sweatman and we cover exactly what this entails and how you can get over it yourself. Hi, my name's Laura Mayhofer, and on this channel, I help you gain health through knowledge and movement. Hello.
Hi. I'll start with the beginning of my Instagram presence. So I started an Instagram account like 5 years ago, I think, and I was doing the Whole30 quite a bit. And training for half marathons, and I was like running. So this was very much maybe accountability, if you will.
Yes.
A lot in my life since then. We adopted my son, and I have gone to grad school. We moved. So many things have changed. So since then, it's gone through changes of, I was an advocate and am an advocate for special education needs with who have kids in the special education system who just want some help understanding the document, understanding kind of their role at the table and their rights at the table.
Yes.
And then learning about that brought me to social work. I did about a year and a half before I realized, I wanted to dig into the policy side of things. And that was what brought me to my current program that I'm in. I'll graduate with my Master of Social Work in like 8 weeks. And I can't wait. So yeah. And there's other things too. I've been developing recipes since I started this account and love to do that just kind of as an outlet. It's really fun. It's the kind of thing that I don't even want to like put too much pressure on because at this point it's really fun.
Yes.
I do that and I send a newsletter every week. I heard you talking about yours.
Yes.
A newsletter that is pretty much focused on mental health, and then I'll share a recipe here and there too. So,
and I love, like I said, I love, that's one of the things that I think is so great about Instagram and so great about the different individuals that I've met on Instagram, because I like that you can show all of these different parts of yourself, because it's never just one thing. I'm not just this advocate, to show parents this. I also, I have this interest in Whole30, or I have this mental health piece, or I have this, or I have that. So I think that's really, really cool and interesting. But like I said, when I was going through, I'm like, she does it all.
And again, putting it in the positive light is helpful, because there was definitely a time when I was like, I need to pick a lane,
Yes.
But what has been really cool is, like, I did a Whole30 recipes takeover about a year ago. I'm doing another, and the number of people, just based on like the sheer number of people who follow that account, came to my account from that one, and then we're like, oh, like, you work in special education? I'm a teacher. I'm a parent. That is one of the like good things about social media.
Yes.
Like, we don't have to call ourselves or feel bad for like showing up with all of ourselves. Like, that's a big value of mine. We run a trauma education group, a business partner of mine and me, and that's what we tell everyone with every group that we come to. It's like, we're here to talk about this book that we're reading together, but you don't have to leave your role as a mother at the door. You don't have to role as a foster parent at the door. Like, whatever it is, you can bring yourself here, you can be that. And so anyway, I think that's the best way for me to show up here, because it's the only can.
Right. Exactly. So now, how did you, when you were coming up with the takeover, which for anyone who's listening, whether you're hearing this later on YouTube, or maybe you're tuning in now, or later on IGTV, Allison did an amazing takeover on purity culture, which I thought was so incredible. And you can watch it in the highlight section. How were you inspired and to come up with that as your topic? Because when someone does a takeover for me, I don't tell them what to do. I sort of say, like, you go what you feel powerful and strong about. So it can be anything, but it's just whatever you feel the expert in. And so when I saw that that was yours, I was like, oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess what it is anytime, because of my own experience in purity culture, the purity movement, the narrative that I was given growing up, because of that, anytime I have like talked about sex or listened to a sex expert talk about sex or anything related to sex, which is like so many things,
Yes.
there's this filter of, you know, what's okay to say, do, think, how to be like sexually.
Mm-hmm.
All of those things are filtered through this narrative that I was given, you know, and your account is one of the few that I followed that are like, there's a lot of sex focus and a lot of sex,
Mm-hmm.
and it's so refreshing. And so I guess thinking about how, especially early when I was following you, I would just be unlearning those narratives. I was still actively unlearning a lot of those narratives so that I could approach pleasure and so that I could approach very appropriate sexual topics and at all, really, without the shame that kind of came from all of those narratives. So as I was unlearning all of that and I thought about who your audience would be, I was like, I can't be the only one.
No, you are not.
Yeah. And
actually
recently read that book that I recommended to everyone, Pure.
Yes.
I read it like 2 months ago. Just, I heard this is really good. And that was kind of what solidified it for me. I was like, yeah, I think I'll share that with them. So
nice. Yes. And I love it. And it's on my Amazon list right now. And I just need to it's like the click the button and then, but see, I have like this, right here, I have like all these books and I'm like, you've got to read the books, Laura, before you get the new book. So I created a list. But maybe for people listening and for me too, I've been trying to get better about this, asking people, how do you define purity culture?
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, purity culture, and you know, I could read the definition from the back of this book, but before I do that, like just off the top of my head, I would say purity culture and the purity movement was a series of messages in the early 90s that gave young people, mostly adolescents, mostly teenagers, a series of messages about what it meant to be pure, which meant to save yourself for marriage sexually. And with that specific, like that sounds really simple.
Yeah.
That came a series of like tangents
that
led to a lot of really oppressive and post-traumatic symptoms in an entire generation. I would say maybe multiple generations, and it's still happening, of people, you know, who grew up with that narrative of purity. And for me specifically, what is most important to understand is that I believe unintentionally the purity movement didn't just say, hey, this is the way to be pure. They tied purity to your rightness before God. If you believe God, you know what I'm saying? So like purity was right below like how you identify religiously. It was like, and as a teenager, as a young, horny teenager, also you better not have sex. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
Said that explicitly, like that's maybe the credit that I'll give is like everybody was really trying to do that. I just also think that there's like a sense of control over sexuality that we see from a lot of religious institutions throughout history. And I think this was kind of just like the way that happened in the early 90s. So, yeah.
Right. And and then how for you did you kind of not figure out, but maybe just sort of discover that you needed to start to unlearn stuff?
Yeah. Woo. I'll try not to get like too.
So I'm like, and we're 14 minutes in and let's just dive right into it.
My journals from 15 years ago. No, it's fine. So for me, it really was like a part of a bigger unlearning, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And it definitely didn't come first. Like narrative related to my own personal sexuality was not one of the first things that I unlearned in the
Mm-hmm.
great beginning of like 2018 was when it started, I guess. And it's
Mm-hmm.
continue for the rest of my life. But I think my own sexuality was something that was influenced by that unlearning probably just about a year ago, maybe a little more. And I have so my husband and I were both raised in like the purity movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a super supportive husband who was like, yeah, we both have a lot to unlearn here. And it's going to marriage and affect our marriage. And like, that's just the dynamic nature of marriage, a healthy marriage, at least ours. And so, yeah, that was what it was like, having a conversation with my partner and being like, hey, this is kind of the way things have always been. This is what I was taught. I know it's what you were taught. Can we like talk about how that has impacted us? Because surely it is. And it was like, of course it has, you know? So, yeah. And part of that, one of those, I guess, tangent, messages of the purity movement, and a lot of women express this in the research in Pure, was this expectation of women to remain basically asexual, like asexual until your wedding night. And then it's like, you better be like just a kitten, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so things like that, we were able, my partner and I were able to, I would read him sections of the book. Can you believe, you know, because it's who were influenced by that in negative ways. But this is mainly from the perspective of women. All that to say, I have a partner who was like there for all of it. And realized, oh, we both have a lot of unlearning to do with it. But I was definitely the first one to be like, listen, I think this kind of messed us up. You need to figure that out. And it's so much better for like sexually and otherwise. Like it's to do that together. And now it's definitely this this very fun way of being like, hey, I just had this thought the other day. And I think that's something that I heard like in youth group in the 7th grade. Whoever taught that? And actually, yeah. And it was even more upsetting to me. Let me tell you why, you know, and it's this very exploratory and accepting way of just, you know, being open about all of those messages and all of those scripts that we were given. So yeah, I guess inadvertently my answer is my husband has had a lot to do with that.
Yes.
Because if I am thinking of about sex heavily and like how scripts changed my view of sex and affect my sex life, he's going to be affected by that.
Totally.
That's been what it's been like for me. Yeah.
And I think it was really interesting too, how you said it didn't necessarily start there. It was this kind of bigger unlearning. I feel like that's a lot of times what I see when it's patients coming to me for stuff, is a lot of times it's like, well, this is a component of it. Or whenever I've done my own self-discovery or friends are doing self-discovery, it's always been like for me, there was a lot with the whole Me Too movement where it was like, okay, gosh, how many situations have I been in where I was the only like female in the room? And oh gosh, I was in some situations where there was a guy in a position of power and they were talking to me in that way. And like, you know, and so for me, that was sort of a thing of like, oh, what does this mean? And like, let's think more about that. So it is this, like you said, sort of an unlearning, relearning, discovery process. And then when you have, partners that get tied in, or my poor dad is an email subscriber, and I always am telling him all of the stuff that I'm doing or different things like that, and he just like is usually like
so interesting to do what you do. I when I send emails that are somewhat personal about mental health and complex trauma that sort of thing, and my mom reads it, I'm like, you know, but I can't imagine if the nature were explicitly sexual.
Yes. And I'm just like, Dad, I just made a video about erectile dysfunction on YouTube. You should totally go check it out. And I'm going to email it to my brother, and my brother's like, and I'm like, let me know. What do you think? You know? And so, yeah, so it is kind of weird, but, yeah, it is like, then they sort of, and again, like, it is funny though, talking to some of these different generations to be like, do you realize about purity culture? Or do you realize some of the things you said to me or whatever? And I think some of the stuff with this purity culture and movement, I know at least for my parents, it was like, don't get pregnant, just get through school.
Yes. Like,
let's not stop.
Like another thing, like we don't say that, like save yourself from is the big message, but
yes,
for God's sake, don't get pregnant.
Yeah.
That's
like
extra, one of the bonus messages.
Yes, I would say so. Like when I was hearing this stuff and you were telling like your stories and all of that stuff, I was like, I got that. And I definitely know, at least for my parents, the undertone was like, no babies.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I just had to laugh because it's like, yeah, it was very much like you have a career, and then now fast forward, now I'm like 35 and I'm like insanely career driven. And my dad's like, you gonna have any kids? And I'm like, what?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm like, what did you think I'm supposed to do? I just switch it the other way. And here's another thing that I think is interesting about purity culture is then, and maybe, you can speak more to this as well, is talking about, okay, now we add in intimacy, pleasure, the fact that, like I have to do a lot of sensory awareness with patients, and that it's not all just genitals. Like you have this whole other rest of your body that's beautiful and amazing. And so like that's something, as I've looked as I've tried to start to lean more into the purity culture and movement to understand and hear people talking about it. It's like, oh, I hope so many more people are listening to this, because are so many of these different components of sexuality, sex, right, all of the stuff that people are missing.
Right. Yeah. And so I have so many thoughts about what you just said, but so the theory of trauma that I ascribe to and continue to learn more about in my graduate studies, and will continue to, is hold on, sorry, my dog.
That's okay.
Come here. I don't know where you're at. Is very somatic. So it's very body based, and it's this idea that part of what trauma does is it cuts us off from our bodies in one way or another. So many different ways that can happen, manifest. And so when you say something like that, you're treating patients or clients who and you're trying to integrate sensory experiences in their whole body, not just their pelvic floor.
Yes.
I'm like, that's such a healing treatment for someone who's experienced trauma, not just overt sexual trauma, not just someone who can verbalize their trauma and tell you a story that is textbook traumatic, but someone who, for instance, heard a message for the first 20 some odd years of their life that said, any pleasure sexually, and really pleasure in general, like
yes, the
evangelical Christian machine has a really strange relationship to pleasure in general. But so feeling any sexual pleasure will harm you, and a lot of love and will love in the future. Like that message, we could just stop there.
Right.
that like your body knows that message as some of the first things that it heard and internalized and embodied and held on to in regard to sex. And so it's not just your genitals, right? It's like your body being able to move through the world in a different way with a different story. It takes a long time to learn all of that. And so when I say that trauma cuts us from our body, it's not always as obvious as with, for instance, the messages of purity culture. Sometimes, people can experience any kind of trauma that dissociates them and takes them away from their body. But I would say that with the purity movement, specifically with the nature of it, we have an opportunity to be very clear. Like, there are people who I'm sure you see so many people who aren't realizing that these messages are part of what is bringing them to need to see you, right? Like, told is a huge part of it. So.
And I think it's interesting when you add in like the trauma piece of it. So I was looking and I saw you posted on your feed, you doing some yoga. And you were talking about that for the last year you've done yoga and that movement and how enjoyable it is to kind of show up and explore your body. And with many individuals who have trauma or have this difficulty with expressing themselves with their partner, with themselves sexually, being able to just do, say, an exercise, like, let's just talk about the fact that like exercise is not like, how many years did I exercise and I put myself to go run, to go bike, to go do whatever, not because I wanted to, not because I wanted the heart health benefits, the strength benefits. It was because I was like punishing myself. Versus now, I'm going to go and I'm going to Orange Theory and I like it because they have really loud music and I like to move my body and do that stuff. And then like, I haven't been visiting my yoga mat as much because it's like, you know what? I don't think I'm I'm not going to go there with a good intention versus, okay, today I am going to go, and like being able to find that kindness and pleasure there, or food. And like you said, I don't want to put too much pressure on myself for this recipe stuff because it's something that's enjoyable and fun. So there's just so many things where we lose that pleasure, that funness.
Yeah. I think that for me, it has been about, in everything that you said, every area of life that it's about removing expectation of outcome, right? I'm going to eat these vegetables and to measure it anyway, it's going to be how I feel versus, will these vegetables change the number on a scale or make me look a certain way? Same with exercise, specifically yoga, and like finding new enjoyment in all of that. And that really does come back to pleasure too. Like, you're not supposed to take pleasure in the things that are not, I should have used, but you're not supposed to take pleasure in these things that are good for you, right? Because of the way that health has been framed. And that is so connected to sexual health as well. And the messages that we all need to unlearn. And I'm still parsing this out, and I've been telling my Instagram community for a long time. My dog stopped scratching her, but yes, you're okay. Oh, anyway, them alive to talk through this, but I'm still parsing it out. And basically, I started going to pretty intense trauma therapy about a year and a half ago. And I haven't talked to my therapist about body image, like not once. But in the last probably 6 months, I felt such a shift in the way that I view my body and the way that I used to use to punish or manipulate my body. It's such a shift. And I know that healing from trauma and becoming just embodied. I wasn't even focusing on loving how my body looks or being neutral toward how I wasn't even focusing on that.
Right.
That has happened as I have just become a more embodied person in general by healing. So it's just really interesting how we parse things out, try to even like disembody our lives in terms of this is body image. This is that happened to me when I was 10. This is the message I heard at church growing up. This is this, but it's all connected.
Yes.
And so from one can give way to healing from another.
Yeah, which is really, really, really incredible. And do you feel like, so you are a parent to 2 beautiful kiddos, and do you feel like as a parent, does it put things under the microscope a little bit for you more to like kind of be like more aware of these things, especially because like that's your background and stuff? Because I know for me, not having kids, I can kind of get away with a lot of stuff because it's like I only have to talk to my partner, and like I don't have, you know, I get like a relatively good amount of sleep because I'm not having to deal with that other stress. So I can get by with a lot. But I feel like if I was like as aware as I am now and then also had like children, I would be like, oh.
Yeah. So maybe it's like yes and no, right? So when I first started really focusing on healing from trauma, a lot of it was for my kids. It really was. It was like, I see myself working all my trauma out on my kids the way that that is how I grew up.
Right.
Unspoken. It comes out in parenting.
Yes.
So realizing that there is a way to process it, and so that is absolutely true. Also, there's so much research out there that can help us cut ourselves some slack if we are parents.
Yes.
It's the expectations are so varied, you know, depending on who you're listening to. It can get so incredibly confusing. And at the end of the day, you're doing something. If you are a parent who is in tune with your child, attuned, like a huge word in the trauma world, in the trauma world, attunement. So if you are attuned to your child for a good portion of the time that you're with them, then you're doing a really great job. I hate the binary of good and bad parent. It's almost like cursing to me.
Yes.
So, but I think that for something that I have encouraged a lot of parents who I've spoken to in all the way I work with parents, something that I encourage them to do is like, it's fine to start out a healing journey, a wellness journey, like whatever it is for your kids. But at some point you are going to have to be enough for yourself. It's you have to, you don't have to forget your kids. First of all, you can't
right.
But at some point you are going to have to be a big reason for yourself, you know,
right.
why you're doing it and why you're putting that work in. And so, so that's why I say yes and no.
So when did it shift for you of like, I started out for my kids, and then do you think it was just part of the process of you doing your therapy, doing your own work, and then you were like, oh, hey.
Yeah. So I'll go back to even before I started trauma therapy, whenever I started like doing Whole30s, and I really there was a time when I started doing Whole30s in a way that was maybe kind of like diety, and it's not intended to be, you know, but that's just because my whole life, every time I had changed what was on my plate, it was in pursuit of a different body.
Yes.
Know how to not do it that way, you know? And I love that the Whole30 is very, very clear about that. And that's 30 is, you know, very other from that, because I didn't have a coach to tell me anything different 5 years ago. Well, that's okay. It was definitely for my kid whenever at the time, whenever I started doing Whole30s, it was absolutely to be healthy for her, you know, to live as long as possible for her. And none of that is bad, and none of that's untrue now,
Mm-hmm.
But, and the trauma work, when I started doing the trauma work, I would say maybe about a year ago, not quite a year ago, it's been more recent, that I have like seen myself as worth the work that I'm putting in. And even if that was the only reason, which again, that's impossible because of being an attuned parent, but even if that was the only reason I was doing it, it'd be totally worth it, So yeah. And my kids definitely get the result of whether or not I'm doing that work, know, on a day-to-day basis. So, like I can't ignore that.
Right.
So I'm doing it for them. But again, for me, I would say just in the last year, 2020 has been, it's like, yeah, it's changed a lot of things that have been really hard. But I think one thing is like a sense of self for me has really grew, that has been good and like worth embracing. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we had someone say, seeing myself is worth the work. So good. Yes. I think that's something that a lot of my physical therapy sessions, sometimes I'm like, am I doing counseling or am I doing physical therapy? Because the things that are coming in is it's convincing people to take the time to do the exercises that I give them. And it's like, I'm purposefully not giving you 5 million exercises to do. I'm only giving you 3 or just some deep breathing with these couple because I need you to do them. And then it's like, okay, well, why aren't you doing them? And it's 9 times out of 10, it is because, like one individual is like, I'm just resigned that this is the card I've been dealt and this is what's going to happen. Or another individual is like, I was up until midnight Googling about potty training my child and why isn't that happening? And then, my house isn't clean and I have to go to school and I'm just racing from pillar to post doing the stuff because they work in the school system. And and it's like, and I'm like, and I get that, I get it. And I was like, but we cannot pour from an empty cup, and it's like, we gotta like, and so I'll write mantras for them, or like I'll decorate a thing saying like, you're worth it, or you rock, or I believe in you. And I'm like, and anytime you think you just have this little thing from Laura, so how do I get others to accept my trauma and the intense work it's taking? Allison, any comments?
Good question. Let me think for a second. I'll have to draw on my own personal experience and not speak from like a professional place, because I know what my therapist would say to me if I asked her that. But I would say that for me, and this might not be an answer that you want to hear, Captain Captivated. But for me, it was about limiting the time with people who were not on board, right? Or and someone doesn't have to know the details of what you're going through or the work that you're doing in order to be on board. I think, and here's the encouraging part, right? And that's also what my therapist would say to me is like, how about some boundaries? Like, can we talk through what boundaries would look like, what specific things you could say at the time with those folks who you feel like are really inhibiting healing? And here's the deal though, that doesn't mean that it's going to be that way forever. So about a year ago, there were people in my life who I was very close to, who I was downright angry at because of the work, because of the stuff from the past that was coming up. People in my life who I was so angry at. And I think that maybe at the time I would have said, I don't think I'll ever be close with them again. I don't think I'll ever talk to them the way that I used to. We'll never. I really believed that. And the work, doing the work, the trauma work, like putting up boundaries at the time but then doing the work has brought us to a place and brought me to a place where being around them is okay now. Like really, in a way that a year ago I wouldn't have you if you would have said, hey, that's actually going to get better. So boundaries, and I know that that's so much easier said than done, but boundaries, limiting time with people who aren't supportive, and then always remember even that is temporary. So yeah, I hope that's really hard.
Yeah, it is. It is really hard. I will say, from, again, not necessarily speaking from a professional standpoint, but from a personal standpoint of being able to also ask yourself, do these individuals deserve to know? Have they earned that right to know? So they're like, if I think of my friends and family in concentric circles, there are certain individuals who have earned the right to get to know kind of the work that I'm doing and get to know the intensity, and I'll share that with them. And there are others that don't get to do that because they're not maybe safe people. And so and that comes back to the boundary setting that Allison was saying. And then for the individuals, speaking from a professional standpoint, when it's talking about physical therapy, and asking people to do different work and different things, again, that boundaries is so darn huge, because it's being able to set time aside for yourself. And a lot of times being kind of open to, but not dependent upon other people to feel that, to be okay or not okay with it. Because many times I might be asking, say someone, they need to do these exercises, so their partner needs to watch the kids. And they're like, well, I kept waiting for my partner to say, okay, I'm ready to watch the kids. And I'm like, you might have to go give your partner your kids and say, I am literally locking the door because I need to do these exercises. Like, I am going to prioritize myself for this amount of time, or saying, hey, honey, I see we're both working really hard or whatever. And how can I help you with something? And then I'm going to need this help with this. And so you kind of have to stick up for yourself. And so pretending you're your best friend, and what would you do to stand up for your best friend? And then doing that for yourself.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll say this. I don't know what she's trying to get. Sorry. I want to say this, just knowing since you disclosed that there's a trauma history there. I do just want to say self-leadership is a really difficult, and self-sovereignty and even like knowing who you are and making decisions out of that is something that can be lost and very, very difficult for people who are recovering from trauma. And so starting with actual questions like, who am I? What do I know about myself? What are the biggest values in my life? That kind of thing is like, sounds so foundational. Well, it is so foundational. It sounds so like, really? You want me to do that? But like, yes, yes. And if you find yourself unable to answer those questions, then there's more trauma work to do. There's more of self to self that needs to happen. But it can be very difficult to do, like set boundaries, have self-leadership, feel a sense of agency and in your life, out of which to make decisions and do things like make a request to your partner. Like, for a person who's experienced trauma, those things are very, very difficult for so many reasons. And
yes.
so just, I do kind of want to back up from what I said and acknowledge that I get that boundaries aren't going to be easy, but also remembering that boundaries don't have to include big, scary conversations, you know, something that you within yourself know you are not going to participate in if it goes a certain direction. You know, like, I'm going to leave. And if I'm asked why, here's what I'll say.
Yeah.
So just a little note on that. It can be really hard.
Isn't it interesting when something came to me when we were talking about boundaries, that you think like with this purity culture, and movement, they are essentially putting in a big boundary of no sex before you're married. Like, here's this huge boundary thing. And the amount, and then the other, like, I was just thinking about how that's such a huge, big boundary. But then the other thing that I was also thinking is like, just the also huge, vast trauma that it causes of, sexual thoughts and feelings and like you said, being able to like just turn it on once the wedding night hits. And then, I think of there was Forgetting Sarah Marshall. There was this funny scene where the guy goes, why do they put like a sewage, like what was God thinking when they put like a sewage dump right next to like a pleasure center or something? I can't, it was like some quote like that. And I just remember laughing so hard because I was just like, yeah, like I've had a patient tell me that, like, and it's like, and so I was just, when we were talking about, when you were saying those things, I was like, what a large boundary that is. And then also all of this, I think it's been such a big thing and it's come up so much in 2020 and so much all of these years and then huge in 2020 because it has been such a traumatizing thing for so many people where even if you really never had anything that someone would say is like a trauma, like you would think of a trauma, that it's like, well, if your entire life, if you were told, no, this is bad, no, this is bad, no, this is bad, and then suddenly, oh, okay, well, you're married now.
Right. Right. Like all, all the rules.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a really important understanding of trauma that a lot of people don't get because we tend to equate, like we say trauma and what we really mean is a traumatic event. It's like one event, but about trauma and what a lot of people are experiencing, especially when we're talking about the results of purity culture, is not just an event, but the trauma is what happens when the brain is being wired a certain way to respond to certain things, to respond to certain stimuli or to not respond to certain stimuli. Like whatever is happening in those really formative years for the brain, some of the most primal parts of the brain sometimes, like that is what we mean by trauma. We mean changes in the brain as a result of something that happens in a developmental year. That's more developmental and complex trauma. When I hear a lot of people talk about being traumatized, they're talking about one event,
Right.
So far from what a lot of people experience.
Yeah, there was one, I remember I had this one therapist that used to work with our pelvic floor physical therapy group. And they used to talk about big trauma, like big T and little t, and kind of what that is in your body and how that holds on. And I think the crazy thing is nowadays, which is becoming even more and more, is that we have these messages that we're constantly being bombarded with because we have our cell phones, we have our, the TV, we have just so much more information coming at us at all times that I think, like you said, it's that the brain is just constantly trying to figure things out and wire itself.
Yep. Yeah. And even now that I said developmental years, but even today, it's still being shaped and changed, especially if we're willing to do that. And so I think a lot of that unlearning from, to harken back to half an hour ago, a lot of that unlearning comes from like more boundaries, like around again, and which can be really hard. And talking about a culture of this is how you be good and this is how you are bad. That kind of binary, or this is how you're in and this is how you're out. when we're talking about a culture that is continually adding conditions to that throughout life, it can be really, really difficult for a who grew up with those messages to put those boundaries up and say, I'm no longer going to take in the results of those messages or the residual of those messages, like whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
You can just genuinely feel, you've been conditioned to feel like shit for doing that.
Right.
Been conditioned to hate yourself for even considering it. And so that is that abandonment of self for the sake of being in is a huge part of trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yes, when the binary, yes, in, out, good, bad. Oh man, it is like, it does. It just like, it's a swear word. Like,
yep.
It, you know, and like, I'll have people come in for me, again, seeing people where they have chronic pelvic pain and maybe they're having pain with intercourse, things like that. And they'll, say, oh, my partner, they, you know, they're so caring. They're such a great partner. And I'll say, okay, well, I'm going to need you guys to hold off on sex then. And they'll say, oh, we can't do that. And I'm like, and like, but I swear,
you shouldn't be having.
Yes. And I'm just,
oh my goodness, I can't.
Yeah. And I'm just like, and I'm like, okay. And I'm like, here's a list of all of the other things that you can do that are just not penetration, you know? And it's like, and again, then having to try to teach people and learn that, like, and I'll be like, remember when you were in high school or college, like, remember that fun stuff that we used to do? And I'm like, I want you to do that stuff instead, you know? And they just look at me like I'm an insane person. And like, I'm like, okay, you know? And so, and it of course depends on their background and stuff, but a lot of times it's like so frustrating and challenging because it's just not how things are pictured nowadays. It's like, oh, I can't tell you when that dang 50 Shades of Grey book came out. I had a couple come in and the guy had like tabbed parts in the book and I just wanted to take the book and whack him across the face with it. And and I was just like, oh, this is so frustrating, you know? And like, yes. And this idea, Brene Brown, she has a really funny example of like, this lady was like eating pasta, like in a nightgown or something, like while also about to just have sex. And she's like, what the hell, you know? And so it's these things in our brain and in that I think we're constantly trying to figure out and decipher what works for us. And it's like, there's no in, there's no out, there's no good, there's no bad. I can't tell you how many years it took me to figure out, like, I'm not a lingerie person. I frickin' hate lingerie. I'm not a lingerie person. I am a tomboy. Like, I've got my backwards hat on. Like, I am like, the fact that, like, yoga pants and athleisure became a, like, acceptable form of clothing. Hallelujah. So it is so like interesting to me when you expand these things from purity culture, purity movement, these being able to have boundaries, understanding what you like, what you don't like, finding pleasure, whether it's in exercise, food, sex, you know, parenting. Where are you on that spectrum? What type of parent are you? And all of that stuff is like, there are so many things that I feel like do come back to knowing yourself, really. And
sure. And I wonder, maybe you've read the book Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski?
Yes.
Yeah. I was like, surely.
Yes.
that was when we talk about this false binary that was given to us, you know, and that's what happened. It was given to us. And this in, out, right, wrong, good, bad, all that. I feel like throughout that book, I should have added that to my recommendations to your people, but that book throughout it, she continually had this refrain of, and that book is about sexuality, sexual pleasure. But like, okay, is this normal? Talking about something sexual. Yes. And then you ask the opposite person, is this normal? Also, yes, you know, and the answer is always yes, in terms of sex drive, in terms of like function of any kind of genital up, like whatever it is.
Yes.
Like, yes, it's normal. It's normal. Whatever it is, we can work with it. Like we I feel like that if we could like take her whole approach to that and the way that she taught about sexuality and apply it to so many other things that is just like, yes, it's normal, whatever it is. Yes, we can work with it. Yes, if society's false binary, you could be very happy existing this way.
Yes.
I think that should be how we all always communicate about everything.
Right.
Highly recommend that book to anybody who.
Yes. That's a good one. I really like that one because again, it's like you said, it's outlining what is normal, and then and I find it interesting to and I can't remember if she said this in her book or if I read it somewhere else, but like people will say, well, what's the normal amount of sex that I should be having, and what's the this and the what's the that, and it's like you and your partner. Like you have to figure it out for you guys. You know, there is no right. There is no wrong. It's, you know, and I am kind of type A. So sometimes I do like having like a little bit of a guideline, but I love this new thing of, and it's probably in that, unlearning and relearning that I'm in, but I love this, like, oh wait, I get to write my own story. Like what? Yeah. You know, that's so beautiful. And so, so that's also one of the reasons why I think it was so cool when we did connect over a year ago and I started to dig in and see all of the stuff you were doing and watch your stories. I was like, damn, I can do all that stuff too. And I can be a mom and a wife too. Oh, that sounds so great.
I love that. I just really think it all comes back to the, like, whatever story you were given that said you can't do that, or you can't do things, or you can, or that's not normal, you know, recognizing that at some point someone told you that, or at least that's what you heard, you know,
right.
Just getting not judgmental, but just endlessly curious about that. Like if you do end up pretty pissed off at someone who told you that one time, that's okay. But that's not start. You don't have to go looking for someone to punish for having told you that story, but just getting curious, like, where might they have gotten it? Who benefits from me hearing any story? And who is there a power there, a control factor that is maybe driving people, perpetuating this, you know, like so many different ways that you can get curious about all of that can kind of help you really own wherever you are in life. So yeah,
I love it. So now tell everyone, where can they find Dynamic Miss Allison? You
can go to AllisonSweatman.com. It's just not and it's fine. And learn a little bit about me there and see recipes and different writings. But I engage on Instagram quite a bit.
Yes.
Allison_Sweatman. And I podcast called Trauma Informed Everything with my friend Andy.
Awesome.
We just wrapped a season, and because 2020 is bonkers, we don't know when we're going to do another one. So all 13 episodes of our first season that just came out.
Woo! Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the takeover, and thank you so much for this amazing, amazing live. I will make sure I'll be putting it up on YouTube, and I can send it to you so you can send it out to your audience as well. And it'll also be available on IGTV.
Hey, thank you so much, Laura. I love what you do, and I'm really excited to connect like this even more in the future.
Yes, definitely. Have a great rest of your evening.
Bye.
Bye.